Hello, I am live. I'm reading out of Eyes of Horus, which is a far memory book by Joan Marshall Grants. She was a writer of her own far memories. This is her life as Ra-Up, and she is a male, an heir to the throne of, or the nomarch of the Oryx. And Ra-Up is now married, and a battle has started, and he is of the nomarch of the Oryx, but there are other nomarchs who are fighting, and he has now started to take his army, and he has met a priest. This is the second part of Trial by Magic. Do you think Tehen exaggerated the power of Heket? From what I know of Tehen, he is not given to overstatement. I share your opinion of Tehen, but I pray that you are underestimating the power of our priests. Then your prayers and mine are the same, for if the news spreads that our champions were defeated, it would be a sorry blow to our cause. All those who are still undecided which side to join, you are kept away from us because they are blinded by superstition, would declare immediately for Menhet. It might be well enough to sway the north away from us. Once they were convinced that the protection of Raha had proved viable, they might even dare to put Amamenet to death. You forget that even our priests were defeated. The captain of the reed must still acknowledge the challenge of the 100. Do you doubt that we should be victorious in that battle? If we had fought it this morning, I would have been confident of success. But if our soldiers have to fight after seeing what they will take for a sign that their gods have already been defeated, well, men cannot fight unless they believe in their gods. Show me an army which does not believe in the virtue of its cause, and that the gods fight with them, and you will have shown me an army defeated before they have loosed a single arrow. I began to wish I had earlier revealed the whole of my plans to the others. When I had started telling them what I proposed to do, I so intended. But for some reason, not even clear to myself, I had stopped short of explaining how the plan of attack would take the enemy by surprise. Certainly Kias had asked me what part the three priests were to play, at which I had looked mysterious, and said she would know that when the time came, and for once her curiosity lay dormant. I tried to imagine that Mary was beside me, giving me the courage of my decisions, and almost immediately I began to be scornful of my unspoken fears. Was I, Ra-Up Hotep, no better than a superstitious fisherman, ready to run away from the powers of darkness rather than to challenge them? By the time we reached our encampment, I had recovered my peace of mind. Only 4 of our men had been injured, for when the enemy had rushed out of the narrow gateway, they had found themselves between close ranks of mace-bearers, who had knocked them down as though they were rats bolting out of the door of a granary. The wounded were being well cared for, and had already been attended by a healer priest and bandaged by Kias. 1 man had a dagger wound in the shoulder, and 2 had a broken arm, of which 1 had had a bone protruding through the skin. The 4th man was still unconscious from a blow on the head, but the Ma'at priest, who had used his trained sight to find out the extent of the injury, reported that as there was no bruising of the brain or crack in the skull, he would recover without any permanent ill effects. Though I had never seen trial by magic, I knew that both priests would concentrate the power available to them into a thought form, which on its own level would be as effective as though it had been brought down to the physical. These thought forms would, of course, be invisible except to those who had been trained to use the sight, which is not limited by the 3 dimensions of earth. So I asked the priest of Ma'at to accompany me to the temple to describe what was actually taking place, and this he agreed most willingly to do. After we had eaten, we proceeded to the temple of Sekhmet. The column now consisted of the full muster of the oryx and the jackal, except for 3 women who had offered to stay with the wounded, and the guards which I posted around the encampment. The man of the hair remained in concealment, for Hanok thought it wiser that a portion of our strength should be undeclared, so as to guard against possible developments. News of what had happened had spread through the old capital, and it was evident that people knew there was to be a trial by magic, for the huge crowd which had already assembled kept a discreet distance from the temple gates. They seemed to think that magical powers had a strictly limited field, and that as long as they kept outside this, they would be safe from the forces they feared, but of whose nature it was obvious they had no understanding. By common consent they seemed to have decided that magic was only dangerous within the length of 2 bowshots, and at this distance they had collected, pressed together, as though leaning against an invisible rope. I deliberately marched my men close to them, before wheeling the column to approach the temple gate, for I thought a close sight of us might dispel the illusion that the south were a pack of disorderly rebels. The majority of the crowd were hostile, but a small boy waved to me and cried out, "Nice soldier," for which he was fondly cuffed by his mother. A few girls smiled back when our men called out to them, but the majority only stared with apprehension or sullen curiosity. "You will soon be marching through the underworld," cried one old woman. "There will be a fine sizzling in Sekhmet's kitchen tonight. Tender young blasphemes please her even more than sacrificial bowls." Here a man near her joined in. "Greedy for bulls, too, is Sekhmet. 3 bulls I gave her last year, promised them to her I did, if my wife should bear me a son. So the old woman did, but not for 7 years. When I'd forgotten, she bowed the bargain. But the priests are good keepers of tallies, and they were quick enough to see I paid my debt. 3 bulls my boy cost me, and an idle, silly child he is too, not worth the tail or the hooves of one of them." This crowd, half frightened, half rivaled, seemed a strange background to an ordeal which might well be the decisive factor in the future of the 2 lands. In the great outer courtyard, the soldiers of the Reed were ranked 12 deep against the north wall, and we took our places opposite them. A black basalt statue of Sekhmet, about twice the height of a man, had been placed at the foot of the steps leading up to the sanctuaries. In front of it was an altar made of the same basalt, and on this was a large gold chalice and a silver bowl. In the center of the open space were 6 circles drawn in black on the stone pavement, 2 rows of 3, 10 cubits apart. They were large enough for a man to stand in them, but if he collapsed, he would fall across the line, and the first to do this was held to have been defeated by the man opposite him. To render the opponent unconscious was the effect most usually attempted, but there were many other ways of making him break the circle. Such trials of will were not unusual in Sekhmet's temple, but nearly always the person set against the priest had no magical training, and soon found himself as powerless to resist as though he were a bird in the eye of a snake. Once this influence had been established, the victim would have to do exactly as he was told by the one who had attained dominance over him. Tenhad had told me he had seen a man running around a courtyard in terror, trying to escape from an invisible dog, which he had thought was snapping at his heels. Another man had gone on all fours and tried to lap water from a bowl which wasn't there, while a third had drawn a knife from his belt and obediently severed the toes of his left foot. There was usually a crowd to watch these demonstrations, which proved most useful in keeping the people in the power of the priests, for they thought that if they disobeyed him, he could, even at a distance, make them behave in any humiliating or criminal way he chose. Den had also told me that sometimes this belief was so strong that people obeyed, without question, any command of a priest, whom they had seen display this sorcerous trick, and would even let themselves be made an instrument of murder, so long as it was not against one with whom they had a long, strong link of affection. Our priests went forward and sat cross-legged behind the circles in which they must stand their ordeal. Their eyes were closed and they seemed entirely disinterested in their surroundings. A line of acolytes, boys with heavily painted faces, wearing tunics of purple linen and necklaces of crocodile's teeth, filed out of the sanctuary and took their places on either side of the statue. They were followed by the priests who were not taking part in the ordeal. Of these there were 20, wearing leopard skins which partially concealed their purple robes, and carrying long staffs, headed either with a crocodile of the underworld or with a cat which symbolized the dark side. Most of them were fat, and one of them had breasts which hung down like the dugs of an old hound bitch. They wore gold amulets, various symbols of Sat or Sekhmet, and several had rings on their thumbs. Their nails were long and ragged, and their hands deeply grimed with dirt. Kias noticed this when I did, and whispered, "Why are they so dirty?" "Because they want to be as different to us as possible. Our priests perform a ceremonial cleansing before prayer, but dirt is their symbol of the grossest aspect of the earth, and so of their channel with the underworld." A black and white temple bull, its horns wreathed with ivy, was now led in. Two of the priests stepped forward, and while one caught the animal by its horns, the other slit its throat, letting the blood gush into the silver bowl he had taken from the altar. Then 2 black goats, a male and a female, were sacrificed. After this, 2 pigeons, whose plumage had been smeared with bitumen, had their heads bitten off by a 3rd priest, and their blood together with some of the blood from the silver bowl, was poured into the gold chalice, which, after being offered to Sekhmet, was placed in the center of the altar. From somewhere within the sanctuary came a sudden shrill scream, quickly stifled. "What's that?" whispered Kias. "They are trying to bribe Sekhmet by every means in their power. She is known to be fond of human blood, but even her priests dare not make the human sacrifice in public. I think they have killed a virgin in Sekhmet's sanctuary. If I am right, another bowl of blood will be brought out in a minute." A priest came down the steps. He was trembling, and a single scarlet gout spilled from the bowl he held so carefully between his hands. "The bowl, the goats, the pigeons, and now the virgin," I said to Kias. "We shall see Hecate come out now." The robe of the high priest was purple and white in wide vertical stripes. His pale, shaven scalp gleamed in the sunlight, and the tendons of his dirty hands stood out like the bones in a bird's claw. His lips were intensely red. They seemed to glitter like metal in his pallid, mask-like face. He had no eyebrows, and the skin was stretched so tightly over the forehead bone that his black eyes were cavernous as a vulture's. He intoned a long evocation before the statue, a string of unintelligible words. Then he lifted the chalice of blood, not to pour a libation, as I had expected, but to drink from it deeply like a man who was very thirsty. Now I knew why his lips had been that glistening scarlet. They were wet with a draught he had already drunk while in the sanctuary. The other 2 priests were there to take part in the ordeal, now followed him in making of evocation, but I noticed that both of them only touched the chalice to their lips and did not drink. Then they moved forward to take their places behind the circles, which they would occupy on each side of Hecate, when the signal was given, although they would not begin their ordeal until the high priest had decided the first trial. Though it was unusual, the 2 second priests had been known to flee from their circle rather than to wait for their defeat to follow, that of him whom they knew to be more powerful than themselves, and sometimes they had been tempted out of their circle by the wish to succour a fellow priest who was struggling in torment or even dying. Our priests had risen to their feet and were standing with their arms outstretched towards Ra, calling silently on his name that his power might flow down into them through the channel opened in the name of Horus, his son. The signal was given, a long note blown on a ram's horn, and the 6 priests stepped forward into their circles. Behind our priest was the bare white wall of the courtyard. Behind the segment priests brooded her statue, her eyes baleful as a stalking cat. The rows of acolytes were now swinging censers, which gave off clouds of incense. Kepa Ra against Heket, Ra against Set. Heket stretched out his right hand, the first 2 fingers extended the thumb, and the other 2 fingers joined in the palm. He knew this method of directing a flow of power was often used both for healing and for destruction. Kepa made no movement, but in his stillness was the temper of a fine dagger. I could see nothing superphysical, yet I was aware of power streaming from him. The Ma'at priest was standing on the other side of me, and he began to describe the form the battle was taking as each priest drove his will against his opponent. Kepa is creating a personification of Horus in the form of a hawk. Not the man with a hawk's head. It's forming about a cupid above Heket's head. Now it is almost complete, perfect, as the gold hawk made by Neku. Into it is flowing the power from Kefa, and also life from the level of the gods. If he can only gather a sufficient power into it, then it will strike down and destroy the will of Heket. Suddenly I saw Kefa flinch as though in great pain. What is happening to Kefa? The eyes of the seer priest were fixed on a point above Heket's head, but at my voice he turned, still with his head over his eyes, to stare towards his fellow priest. Heket is indeed a powerful magician. He has thrown a serpent of Apep about Kefa. 3 of its coils are around his legs and thigh, and its fangs are buried deep between his shoulders. Its mouth is wide open against the skin. It is sucking the life out of him, draining his strength with every second. I saw with horror that Kefa no longer held his upright position. His knees were slightly bent, his back curved, the elbows braced back as though he were trying to resist the desperate pressure which was driving him relentlessly forward. Sweat was pouring down his body. It was almost possible, without being a seer, to know what was forcing him into such an unnatural position. The hawk tells me of the strength of the hawk. Tell me of the strength of the hawk. It's growing larger. No, now it's swaying. It looks as though it were going to fall. Now 1 wing has grown a little blurred. Even those who saw nothing except 2 men standing opposite each other in the brilliant sunshine must have been conscious of the tremendous manifestation of power. Nothing visible touched the 2 priests. They made no sound. Yet the sweat of extreme exertion was sluicing down their bodies, and one of them was curiously contorted, looking as though he must have fallen if something invisible that had closed him in its coils was not supporting him, while it completed his destruction. The seer priest was whispering to himself, "Horus, let him triumph. He is trying to build up your hawk. Help him in the name of his father. Make the hawk live in your power." Then his voice grew louder. "It's getting stronger. Look, look, it's towering to strike." All eyes fixed on Kefa, who seemed about to collapse. Suddenly, as though with an almost impossible exertion of strength, he drew himself erect. He stretched out his hands, then brought them down to his sides like a hawk folding its wings before it plunges on its prey. Heket screamed, the high, frantic scream of a hare in the talons of a hawk. With one hand he plucked at his throat, while the other he seemed to be trying to defend his eyes. He screamed out, "I shall be blind, blind." Again I heard the seer's voice. The hawk's got him by the throat. Its talons are buried deep in his flesh. He will never find the strength to tear them out. It is pecking at his eyes. He believes it is blinding him, so it will blind him. He will never see again, and with his sight, so has his power been taken from him. Look, the power of the serpent is already broken. Hackett staggered frantically backwards, trying to beat off that which was attacking him, even without a seer to tell me the form in which Kepha had personified his power. I should have known the Hackett fought against some great bird. The high priest of Sekhmet was now only a man, blind and powerless, stumbling for shelter, screaming for his fellow priests to save him. The habit of obedience was strong in them. They ran after him, and so left their circles. Wow, that was an exciting chapter. I hope the sound worked fine.